My favourite part of the Cambridge B2 First is the speaking. It's a fantastic place to pick up valuable points, and while some parts are a little bit tricky, you can prepare your students for maximum success. I'm Will from Enchanted ESL, and I've been preparing students for Cambridge exams since 2015. This video is part of a whole series on preparing for those exams, so if you haven't already seen the overview video, I recommend you go and watch it now and then come back to this one. I'll link it up there and down in the description, because from now on I'm assuming you have a background information about what the Cambridge B2 First is. Right now we're going to dive into the speaking part. And it's my favourite part because my students do really well in it. For the majority, it's the part where they get the highest grade, and that can compensate for difficulties in other areas, leading to them getting a pass. In fact, quite a lot of the time they get a grade above the level of the exam they're doing. I've had a lot of B1 students get B2 in the speaking, and some B2 students get C1 in the speaking. First of all, we're going to look at the overall structure and format of the exam. And then we'll talk about how it's marked, how it's assessed, because that's really important. After that, we'll get into the 4 different parts, and I'll share all of my strategies and tips on how you can train your students best. I strongly recommend you download a copy of the B2 First Teacher's Handbook. It has all the information you need to know about the exam, and we'll be referring to it in this video. I'll link it up there and down in the description, along with a video created by Cambridge, which is an example exam with Florine and Maria. It's an actual exam, they're not actors or anything, and it's a fantastic way of seeing how it works and then looking at the examiner's comments to see how well they performed. So the exam takes about 14 minutes and is divided into 4 parts. The interview, the long turn, the collaborative task, and the discussion. One thing that stands out about the B2 First speaking is that it's done in pairs. 2 students doing it at the same time. There are also 2 examiners. One examiner asks the questions and does a little bit of assessment, and the other examiner sits in the corner and listens and does the bulk of the assessing. The exam is not recorded, it's assessed in the moment. On rare occasions, students might end up doing it in a 3 instead of a pair, like if there's an odd number of people and they need to throw someone into another group, but that's very uncommon. In those cases, it takes 20 minutes instead of 14, and there are a few little tiny things that students need to adjust to, but ultimately it's the same thing. At different points, students are expected to speak on their own, answer questions from the examiner, and talk with their partner. That's why they do it in a pair. The focus of the speaking is mostly on communication rather than accuracy. Sure, you want your students to say things the right way, but you don't want them getting mental blocks or panicking or worrying too much about getting every single word and every single phrase exactly correct. It's really important that they're spontaneous and interactive. And that's reflected in the assessment criteria. So let's have a look at that. It's on page 79 of the Teacher's Handbook. The whole thing is graded out of 25. 20 points are awarded by the examiner who sits in the corner and listens, based on 4 different categories. And the other 5 points are given by the examiner who asks the questions, and that's a global achievement. The 4 categories are grammar and vocabulary, discourse management, pronunciation, and interactive communication. Okay, technical words, and I will explain what all of them mean right now. Grammar and vocabulary is more or less what you'd expect. For maximum marks, students have to show a good degree of control of a range of simple and some complex grammatical forms, and use a range of appropriate vocabulary to give and exchange views on a wide range of familiar topics. This does not mean they have to be perfectly accurate. There's more of a focus on range. A good degree of control means that if students try something a bit more advanced, they'll get rewarded for it even if they make a mistake while doing it. Again, it's really important that your students don't get hampered by perfectionism. Mistakes are okay. As long as they're not making really basic mistakes all the time, they can get away with a few errors here and there. And if they're trying really good advanced stuff, then errors are completely fine. So I would encourage your students to express themselves using all of the fantastic grammar and vocabulary that they've been learning. The second category, discourse management, is all about structuring a coherent stretch of speech. So things to avoid are hesitation, talking in circles, going off topic, and not linking ideas. It says very little hesitation here, and that suggests they can't take a few seconds to pause and think. They can. As long as it's not really frequent and goes on for too long, they can take a few seconds just to think about what they're going to say next. After all, us native speakers need to do it sometimes. We don't know what we're going to say next. Give us a moment. So hesitation here is really going for more than 2 or 3 seconds of or panicking and having a mental block, which is something we'll get to a little bit later. Talking in circles and going off topic is something that some students tend to do, often younger students. It also appears in students who don't really know what the task is and they are unsure about what they have to say, so they talk about something completely different in the hopes that the more words they say, the better they'll do. By practicing technique, which you're going to do with your students, you can all but eliminate this. And finally, if students can link what they say to what their partner says, then they get extra points here. Using connectors like however on top of that and first of all are all really good too. And we'll see more specifically how to do those things when we get into the individual parts. Next up is pronunciation. I usually don't have to worry too much about this because my students generally have pretty good pronunciation. If they speak clearly and use the right kind of stress and tone, they'll be completely fine. And anybody who's thinking about doing the B2 first should have enough English to be able to do those things without much issue. However, do be careful with some mistakes, and these will be particular to their native language. For example, my Spanish students always say city instead of city, which is very frustrating and it's a mistake that comes up all the time. So those kind of things can cost a few points here and there. But again, like the grammar and vocabulary, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. And one thing they don't have to worry about is their accent. Pronunciation and accent are different things. It is not required to speak like the British royals. If they have an accent from wherever they're from, as long as they're understandable, intelligible, and the person listening knows what they're saying, then it's completely fine. The final category is interactive communication. This is mostly relevant with how much information they give in an answer and how they converse with their partner. So this is really important in parts 3 and 4, the collaborative task and the discussion. So it says here, initiates and responds appropriately, linking contributions to those of other speakers. This means they give plenty of information in their answers, but don't go on for too long and go off track. And linking contributions to those of other speakers, that means agreeing and building on what their partner says, or disagreeing and offering a different perspective. It's like having a real conversation. Next it says maintains and develops the interaction and negotiates towards an outcome. This is basically keeping a discussion going and being able to manage it so everyone shares their point of view and there's an attempt to find an agreement. This is super relevant in part 3, but essentially it means, is the student proactive in taking the conversation forward, and are they reactive to what their partner says? As you can see, the assessment goes a long way beyond just vocab and grammar and language things, and you really need to pay attention to these other parts to get the maximum marks. A student who is not prepared in these will lose a load of marks just because they don't have the correct exam technique. And from where I stand, there are tons of points to pick up here without really learning any extra English. If students know how to do the exam in the right way, they can be not very good with their vocab and grammar and still get a very solid score. Oh, and if you're wondering about the other 5 points that's given by the examiner who asked the questions, they're just a general achievement score, but there's a slight bias towards discourse management. You can see the scale on page 78 of the handbook. But please bear in mind that the actual examiners don't use this scale, they use one that's a lot more complicated. They've put this one in the handbook so us teachers can see how it works, and there's plenty for us to go with. So I recommend you take some time to look at the assessment criteria, it's not particularly interesting, but then go and watch Florine and Maria's video and see how the examiner notes match up to the assessment. Because then you can go and assess your own students and you're calibrated to what those words in the assessment criteria actually mean compared to the points that you get. So let's get stuck into those individual parts, starting with part 1. Of course. So part 1 is called the interview. This is a very simple, very straightforward part that's mostly designed just to get the students warmed up and feeling comfortable in the exam environment. Yes, what they answer and what they say is assessed, but there's no particular language that they're expected to use. The examiner will just ask them a few personal questions like, where are you from? What do you like doing in the evenings? Where did you go on holiday last? Nothing crazy here. The first 2 questions are always, what is your name and where are you from? There's no need to give a long extended answer to this, just, my name is Will and I'm from Madrid in Spain. That's plenty. Your students can, if they want, say a little bit more detail in their answer to where are you from, for example. I'm from Madrid in Spain, but I grew up in England. After those 2 introductory questions though, they'll get another few and they are expected to say a lot more in their answers. About 20 to 30 seconds. Here we're looking at page 75 of the Teacher's Handbook. The examiner instructions are: select 1 or more questions from any of the following categories as appropriate. So there's a bunch of possible questions and the examiner will try to make them relevant to the student as much as they can. And they'll ask as many questions as they need until the 2 minutes expected for part 1 ends. Ideally, students will only end up answering about 2 of these questions, maybe 3. If they're answering more than that, then their answers are probably way too short. Let's take the first one. How do you like to spend your evenings? Here's a bad answer. I usually watch TV and then go to sleep. Way too short. Here's a better one. It depends on the day of the week. If I have work the next day, I'll eat dinner, watch an episode of a series, and then go to bed. But if it's a weekend, I usually try to go out and spend some time with friends, in a bar or restaurant, or maybe even go bowling or something. And that's about the right length. I tell my students to try and say at least 2 or 3 things in their answer, connect a few things together. And you can see how this would get some points in discourse management. There's some structure there. We've set up that there are different options at the beginning, then we say one of them, and then there's a but, and then we say the other one. So that is a very structured answer. And we can improve it even more by changing that but with a however. Obviously, you need to tell your students how much information they need to say, but you can also train them in some clever practice. If you watch the Florina and Maria video, you can see a couple of things the examiner does to help them. Train your students that if they hear a short pause and they see the examiner with their listening face on, then they need to say something more. But if the examiner nods and says, "Thank you," they can judge from the body language that they've said enough and time is running out, they need to ask another question to the other partner. Some of the questions aren't that easy and it's difficult to come up with a good response with enough points. That's fine as long as it's not the case for all of the questions. And to avoid this happening completely, just practice loads of different types of questions. With an individual student, I'll ask them a whole bunch of questions and help them develop their responses and think of new things to say. With a group, you can do a kind of speed dating activity. They each have one of those questions with them and they go and match up with a partner, and for 30 seconds one of them asks one question, the other one answers, another 30 seconds they swap round, do the same thing. And then once that's finished, they change partners, the same thing goes on until they've all answered the questions from all of the other people in the class. And the 30-second time limit adds a little bit of tension and stress, which is important to get used to for the exam. And also it tells the students how long they have to speak for. So part 1 is the most straightforward. Part 2, on the other hand, is quite stressful, quite nerve-wracking, and quite difficult. But with the correct training and practice, you can get it nailed down. What students have to do is compare and describe 2 photos and answer a question about them. All of that in just 1 minute, and they're talking on their own for that whole minute. For some students, this 1 minute feels like an eternity, and for others it goes by in a few seconds. But the format is always the same, so you can prepare a structure and practice it. So in the handbook, page 76, we have some people on a bus and some people getting on a plane with the question, why have the people decided to travel in these situations? The big issue with this part is managing the time and organizing thoughts. So I have a formula that I teach my students and they practice until it's automatic. They don't need to worry about how much time they've got left, and they don't need to think about, well, what do I say now? Because they have that structure in place. So they'll spend roughly the first 30 seconds comparing and describing the 2 pictures. And then the last 30 seconds they'll spend answering the question. When describing and comparing, it's vital to be concise. Just a brief summary about the general idea of what is happening. They don't need to focus in on lots of details. They can add in a little bit of speculation as well for some extra points. Let's do an example. In the first picture, I can see some young people on a bus. I think it could be a school bus, or maybe just a public one. Meanwhile, in the other picture, there are people getting on a plane at the airport. They are travelling further than the people on the bus, maybe to another country. That's all that's needed. There's no requirement to focus on specific people or objects, otherwise the time will just disappear. Notice how I structure it too. In the first picture, I can see. That's a great way to start. or you can do first of all or to begin with. Then I said, meanwhile, in the other picture, and that's a great way of transitioning to the other one and getting points for discourse management. Alternatively, you could say on the other hand if it's a complete contrast, or likewise if you're comparing something that is similar. What students should avoid is pointing at the pictures and saying, here I can see, or here there is. You have to imagine you're speaking to somebody who has never seen the photos, so you have to explain using your words. Also, they should be careful not to flick back and forth between the two photos too rapidly. Just do your concise summary on one and then the concise summary on the second one. Then we can move on to answering the question. And doing this, we kind of have a similar structure. We start with the first picture and we answer the question relevant to that, and then we move on to the second picture and answer the question in that context. The people on the bus have decided to use it because it's cheap and convenient. They are not going far, maybe to somewhere in the same city, like their high school. On the other hand, the people getting on the plane need to travel a long way in a short amount of time. They could be going on holiday or on a business trip. Notice that there's plenty of speculation here. The question is usually designed to get the student to think of possibilities. And giving your interpretation of what might be happening is a B2 level piece of language. It's a step up from B1 where you just describe what you see. So 30 seconds for each part. This requires quite a lot of training. Knowing how long a minute is takes some time to get used to, and you want your students to go through a bunch of different difficulties so they're prepared to deal with those in the exam. In the Florine and Maria video, you can notice a couple of things. Florine keeps on talking right up until when the examiner stops her, and the examiner says, "Thank you." And it sounds like she's interrupting. It seems a little bit rude, and Florine is like, okay. But that's a good thing. That means she said plenty, she's got to the time limit, and she said all she needs to say. That's great. Maria, on the other hand, she starts off quite well, but near the end she just stops talking, and the examiner waits, and there is an awkward, excruciating silence. No, it's a disaster. Well, it's not the end of the world as long as it's not like 30 seconds of silence. So the best way to train this is to do it a lot with the timer. Your students will hate it at first, and in fact they'll continue to hate it right up until they do the exam, but it is the best way for them to get better at managing their time. And there are 3 common issues that might come up during their speech of 1 minute. The first is not being able to cover everything in the minute and not having enough time to talk about the question. So they really need to practice making concise and brief comparisons and descriptions at the beginning so they have plenty of time for the question. The second problem is the opposite. Getting it all done way too quickly. Some students speak very fluently and the words just come out in a fantastic fast stream, but that means their ideas run out quickly. So what do they do if they have time left? They can't just sit there and say nothing. I mean, they can, but they shouldn't. In those cases, it's good to improvise a few details from the pictures that support the argument that they've already made. For example, the people on the bus look bored because they're on their phones or reading. They probably do this journey every day. On the plane, it's probably more exciting because most people don't fly very often. So in this way, we're kind of adding something extra. We're still answering the question more or less, but we're just using some details like the people in the picture to support what we already said. Ideally, your students will never have to artificially extend their answers a lot. They'll get used to the timing, be able to manage it. But if you find them doing it frequently, I recommend you get them to talk for 2 minutes about the pictures. This means they'll get used to coming up with more ideas and having more thoughts in their mind about what they see. Of course, you should go back to practicing it with 1 minute afterwards, otherwise they might go back to the first problem of not having enough time. The third problem is having a mental block in the middle of speaking. This can be on the word level or on the idea level. And this is something that some students do, especially at the beginning. It's stressful, they're on the spot, and sometimes their minds just go clouded or blank and they panic. On the word level, when they can't think of the specific word that they want to say, that's pretty easy to get around. You just move on. Don't worry about getting everything perfect. If they don't know the word, carry on, accept that's a small hit you're going to take, but if you spend 10-15 seconds trying to think of it, then that's 10 or 15 seconds when you're not saying lots of other brilliant words. And the examiners will not penalise knowing that word. It's more about what words you do say rather than the words that you miss. The idea block comes from not having that structure automated in the mind. That's why we practice the formula again and again, so they have it in their minds and they don't need to worry and think, oh, what comes next? Because they know. So practice this frequently, and you can play games like Just a Minute or do small presentations to kind of develop these long-term speaking skills. Oh, and there's another thing in part 2, which is where the other student answers a question about the topic of the photos. So candidate A, let's call her Anna, talked about the bus and the planes in their 1 minute. Now the examiner will ask candidate B something about the topic of transport, and it might be relevant to the photos. For example, do you like traveling by plane? Treat this like a question from part 1. It's usually asking for a personal opinion or experience, and it should last about 20 to 30 seconds. Bonus points for connecting the answer to something candidate A said in their speech. This is a great example of interactive communication and will get the maximum marks. So a great answer would be, yes, I love traveling by plane. The experience of flying is a little scary sometimes, but like Anna said, usually you go somewhere interesting when you fly. If I'm on a plane, that usually means I'm going on holiday, so I'm very excited. Then the candidates will switch roles and candidate B will talk about their photos and candidate A will answer a question on. The whole of part 2 takes about 3 minutes. Okay, moving on to part 3, the collaborative task. This is where the candidates have to talk to each other. If you're teaching a group, this is quite easy to prepare because you can put them in pairs and see which ones work best together, and those pairs are the ones that will take the exam together. With an individual student, it's trickier. First of all, they don't know who their partner is going to be, and second, they don't really have a partner of a similar level to practice with, so you have to substitute. And that's a little bit difficult when you're the examiner and the candidate at the same time. But it is doable, I've done it plenty of times, so don't worry too much. In this part, students are given a question or situation with 5 different potential answers. In the handbook, page 77, we have how important are these things for keeping fit? And then 5 things related to fitness. Students get 15 seconds to look at the questions, and then they have 2 minutes to discuss with each other the benefits and the disadvantages of the options. And then the examiner asks them to decide which one is the best or the most important. They have 1 minute to do this. Usually they just have to decide on one, but in this particular example, they have to decide the 2 best options for keeping fit. And notice the second question is slightly different because it's asking for the best options in the long term. And that might be different to what students discussed initially. Alright, let's break this down. The first phase is 2 minutes. And that's not very long when you consider both students have to speak and there are 5 different options to cover. So again, timing can be an issue here. Ideally, students will talk about at least 3 of the options. 4 or 5 is best, but 3 is okay. 2 or 1 and they've spent too long talking about that and going into detail. And also, if they talk about all 5 and still have time to spare, then they've rushed way too fast. But I find this very rarely happens. Part of the interactive communication is managing this, moving the conversation forward once you've covered the appropriate points, but not going too fast and ignoring what your partner has to say. So we don't really want to go into too much depth of reasoning for each option. I mean, in theory, you could spend 10 minutes discussing just one of them, but we have to get that down into like 30 seconds pretty much for both people to give their opinions. So the way I like to present it to my students is with a loose sort of structure that they can follow. I get them to initially practice it in quite a structured way, but as they get used to it, they can be a bit more flexible with how they interact with each other. So first, student A starts by suggesting an option and giving a reason. And then they ask student B what they think. Student B agrees or disagrees. If they agree, they shouldn't repeat the same reason, but just move on to another option. If they disagree, give a brief reason why and suggest a better alternative. So in both cases, they've moved the conversation to a different option. And they should give reasons for their next one and ask student A what they think about it. And then just like student B has just done, student A agrees or disagrees with that second option. If they agree, again, don't repeat the reason, move on. If they disagree, say why and suggest an alternative with a reason and ask student B what they think. And this back and forth continues until they've covered most of the topics and the time runs out. What you really want to avoid is students just agreeing for everything and then just repeating the reasons that their partner just said. Disagreeing is a good thing. You don't want to do it all the time, but it's a great way of developing the conversation, giving a different point of view, and then you can move on to a better alternative that you suggest. However, it is not a competition. There is no right answer. Students shouldn't be emotionally invested in one of the answers being the one they choose. Let's look at an example to see how this can play out. Student A, that's Anna, starts. For me, getting 8 hours of sleep every night is so important. If you don't rest your body, it will not be in a good condition, and you can suffer lots of problems later in your life. What do you think about that? Student B says, I disagree with you. For some people, getting only 6 or 7 hours a night is enough to avoid those problems. I think it's more important to go to the gym regularly. Physical exercise builds your muscles and improves your circulation so you feel better and can do more. Do you agree? Student A says, yes, I'm with you on that, but I don't think you have to go to the gym. Instead, running or cycling or doing other sports like basketball improves your fitness. From my point of view, it's better to spend time outdoors than in a busy gym. Student B says, you're right about that. It doesn't really matter where you do exercise. What do you think about eating at regular times? That could be important. Student A says, yes, it's kind of important. The body likes routine, so if you eat breakfast at the same time every day, your body is ready for it. But don't you think it's more important to eat things that are healthy rather than the time you eat? Student B, of course. I don't think meal times are that important. Does it really make a big difference if you eat a lot at breakfast or at dinner? And at this point, the examiner will stop the conversation because they've run out of time. Notice how they interacted with each other, and everything they said moved the conversation forward. They add their point of view with a few extra details and start talking about another option, and then they pass it back to their partner. Sometimes what I see with students is one of them talks for 1 minute on their own, and then passes it over to the other student who talks for 1 minute on their own. That's really not ideal. You need students to be passing it back and forth quite frequently. Of course, they want to develop their arguments, but they do need to engage with the other and react to what they say. That's all the interactive communication, that's where most of those points will come from. In the Florine and Maria video, you can see how Florine constantly tries to include Maria in the conversation, and that's fantastic. She's always asking her. Maria, not so much. She kind of says her opinion and then leaves it there for Florine to pick up. Also, Maria tends to repeat what Florine says, especially about the security cameras. She doesn't offer that much new to the conversation. Obviously, if students can practice with the partner they'll have in the exam, then they can really refine this and get it down to a mutual agreement of how much you talk and who starts and that kind of thing. But with an individual student who doesn't know who their partner is, it's difficult to know what to expect, and that can be quite worrisome. The first possibility is they get a partner who just doesn't speak very much at all. In this case, your student should make sure to constantly be trying to include them in the conversation, even if they don't give much in response. If your student does that, they'll get all the points they need. The other side of things is the other student dominates the conversation and doesn't let your student speak at all. In that case, it's a little bit tricky, especially if your student is shy, but they need to be confident enough to interrupt and get their point of view across. However, it's very, very unlikely that they'll have a partner like this. None of my students have ever reported anything like that. They've always had people who were happy to have a conversation. They know it's a collaborative task. And super important, what the partner does not affect your student's grade. This is really important to emphasize to them. If your student does the right things, tries to engage with them in the right way, it doesn't matter what they do. The examiners will see what's going on, and they'll give your student the points that they deserve. I repeat, this very rarely happens, but it's worth going over with your student just so they feel better and more prepared. It's nerve-wracking enough without having to think about what your partner might do or not do. So give them these strategies to go in with, and they'll know that whatever the situation is, they can handle it. Now let's move on to the second phase of part 3, where they have to come to an agreement on which one, or in this case which two, are the best options. Negotiation language is at play here, another thing that contributes to interactive communication. This phase can go quite badly wrong. Sometimes students just agree straight away, and then they have a whole minute to fill with I don't know, whatever they can think up and oh, there's another idea, let's talk about that for no reason, and then agree on the same thing at the end. This is actually what happens with Florine and Maria. They decide pretty early on and then they have to start including another option and it's forced. The alternative is that students never agree on the answer. This isn't actually the worst thing in the world because there's no requirement for them to come to an agreement, but it's better if they do because they've showed the language that they're capable of doing that. And with no right answer, it's perfect for one student just to compromise near the end. They don't need to be stubborn with what they think is the best answer. It doesn't matter. The way I get my students to handle this is by narrowing down the options early on. Not too much, but so you don't get distracted by all of the 5 options and repeat the whole thing that you did earlier. Usually they have to decide on one of the options. That's the most common thing. So I get one of the students to say, for me, either X or Y is the best option. They narrow it down to 2. Then they can spend the whole minute debating the merits and the disadvantages of those 2. And they can base those 2 that they choose on what they've already spoken about. Which 2 were the most popular ones when you were talking about it before? So let's say Anna begins and she says, for me, the best 2 options are probably going to the gym or spending time outdoors. Now, student B can suggest one as their preference. So they're kind of putting out their stall as, I think it's going to the gym. Now, student A, whether they agree or not, should argue the other one. And so for the next minute, they go head to head and try to say which one is better. And then at the end, one of them decides to compromise and says, oh, you've convinced me. I think you're right. Let's say this one is the best one. In this particular example in the handbook, they have to decide on 2. They can do exactly the same thing, but instead of at the start narrowing it down to 2 options, they should narrow it down to 3. Do the same kind of argument for the minute, and then come to an agreement at the end on 2 of them. As always, practicing this a few times is vital for them to get used to the timing and the structure of it. But don't put too much pressure on your students. It is quite difficult to manage, and each time they do it, it'll be a little bit different. It doesn't matter if they don't get it perfect. As long as they try to engage in a back and forth conversation, express their opinions, ask their partner what they think, and at the end come to some kind of agreement, then that's all they really need to do. Alright, now on to the final part, the discussion. And after parts 2 and 3 had quite specific formats, we're back to a more simple exchange here. The examiner starts a question and answer exchange with the student, but by the end it does become more collaborative. And the questions here are not personal, like what are your preferences and what do you do at the weekend. They're more about giving an opinion on something, and the topic is always related to what they spoke about in part 3, in this case, fitness. So think of more discursive questions. Here's an example that is, what is the advantage of keeping fit with friends? It's not something about the student's personal life, but it's something they definitely can have an opinion on. Another is, do you think the government should spend more money on sports and leisure facilities? By the way, if you're doing the first for schools, then these questions will be adapted to be appropriate for teenagers. So the examiner will ask the question to one student who gives their answer, and then they'll ask what the other student thinks to the same question. This will happen with 2 or 3 questions. And then the examiner will move on to a slightly different type of question. They'll ask it to both of the students and give them a gesture. This. That means they have to talk together. So now the students are expected to have a kind of free-form discussion and debate the answer, giving their opinions, maybe disagreeing. So in those early ones, the answer should be about 30 seconds, giving your opinion. Kind of like part 1, maybe a little bit longer. Then the second student has the opportunity to pick up on some of the points that the first student made, react to them, develop them. That's where some of this interactive communication is going to come in as well. And they should avoid just repeating what the first student said. They need to say something different. For example, the examiner asks student A, what are the advantages of keeping fit with friends? And she's going to say, I think it's a great idea to keep fit with friends because they can motivate you. When you're feeling tired or you don't want to exercise, they will encourage you or even shout at you to make you work harder. You can set up a regular group of fitness buddies and everyone does better than if they were alone. Then the examiner asks student B, what do you think? And a good answer would be, well, I don't really agree. Anna said that you can set up a regular group, but that's very difficult. You are relying on other people too much. What if some of them cancel? Then you don't do exercise because the group is not there. I think it's better to be independent when you keep fit because you can choose when to exercise. A contrasting answer that references what Anna says. Perfect. And it doesn't have to disagree, but if it does agree, then it should bring something else to the table. For example, they could say, I think Anna is right. Lots of people exercise with others, usually in a class at the gym or something. If you go with your friends, it's more fun, and the exercise doesn't feel so horrible when you're all doing it together. And when we get to the second type of question, this question, the same principle holds true. They shouldn't repeat each other, they should react to what the other says, and they should use some of what happened in part 3, that kind of managing how much each person speaks and asking each other questions. A lot of my students excel at this because they practice talking to each other a lot. They're comfortable keeping an exchange and making sure everybody is able to contribute equally. So I recommend you practice this all the time with your students. Maybe at the end of each class you have 10 minutes of just free-form discussion. You ask a few questions and people can share their ideas. And your students don't need to stress about timings here. It doesn't really matter how much they talk. If there's one question that they don't have much interest in or aren't informed about, they don't have to extend it out to a massive, complicated answer, because the examiner will just ask them another one, and that one might be more suited to what they know and what they can speak about. Obviously, if all of them are really short, that's a bit of an issue, but if one or two of them they don't say masses, then that's fine. And that's the exam done. Parts 1 and 4 are a lot more straightforward. Parts 2 and 3 require lots of practicing specific technique. But with the right tools and training, they can get a really high mark in this. And if you're wondering, both Florine and Maria passed the speaking. Maria only just, and despite all of her grammar errors and her not very good interactive communication, she still managed to get a pass grade. So I think your students, once you've trained them up, can do a lot better than that. They should be aiming more at what Florine got. She actually got maximum points. So don't worry if your students don't quite have the same level of grammar and vocabulary that she did. I mean, she has exceptional language skills, but even so, even if your students are a little bit lower on that, they can get loads of points in interactive communication, discourse management, and even pronunciation. And this is why the speaking is my favorite part. You can train your students to produce the specific language and the specific types of interactions that are required to get loads of marks. And the same is true for the writing as well. I've got a particular strategy with a few tips for the writing, which I'll share in my next video in this series. And when that's made, it'll be right here. But for now, I've been Will from Enchanted ESL, wishing you all the joy and success in your teaching. See ya!